Family bangers set to square off coming up this weekend at UFC 282. It's a home game for the action man, Chris Curtis. He was a winning corner last weekend, repping his boy Roman Dolidze, that calf slicer, that ground and pound against Jack Hermansson. And that was a great revenge fight for Dolidze because that, of course, was Curtis's last loss. So he was able to bring that into the cage, help out his pupil, and move forward, taking on new Mansa, Joaquin Buckley, who is a walking highlight reel. Now, both of these guys had big win streaks snap their last time out. For Chris Curtis, again, Hermansson. For Joaquin Buckley, taking on Nasruddin Imavov. And Buckley looked like 2 weight classes smaller in that one. Like, Which
is weird, because I always think he's kind of big for the division. I know he's short, but he's built like a brick shithouse.
Yeah, no, Imavov was like massive.
You're right.
And for Buckley, he did have some successes in that fight, and we can kind of break it down round by round, but he was a pretty big underdog there. He's a plus 200. Won round 3 on 2 of the 3 scorecards. He came out like a bat out of hell knowing he needed to win that 3rd round. And if you watch just the last, 20 seconds, he's just out there running across the cage, throwing everything he can and landing on Imavov. But Imavov's got a great chin. So for Buckley, he brings all of that experience into the cage, the Bellator experience, the UFC fights, and he's taking on a guy who has maybe the most experience in all of MMA, and Chris Curtis. And for Curtis, you might be sour on his last performance against Jack Hermansson because he didn't look like the guy that we saw in the UFC making the debut. Like, he had beat Phil Haas, Brennan Allen, and Vieira by being offensive and throwing with a lot of power. And against Hermansson, he was kind of tentative on the outside and didn't throw a ton. And just like Billy Quarantillo, Chris Curtis is known to frequent the comment section below the Fight Night Picks videos. So for Curtis, I expect him to be, full Chris Curtis. Full powers Curtis. I expect full powers Buckley. And I'm really looking forward to this fight. And I don't look at it as a 35-year-old and a 28-year-old. These are 2 game guys in the middleweight division with your 14th ranked Curtis and just like the 16th middleweight in Joaquin Buckley in this fight.
And that does feel like where Joaquin Buckley is in the division, because he can beat pretty much anybody on the outside of the rankings. That's the type of power that he does carry in his hands. But the guys who have a little bit more refined technique in the rankings are going to give him trouble. We saw that a lot in the Imavov fight. Imavov a lot more straight shots, whereas Buckley throws those big looping hooks. But that's why I think this fight should be so entertaining. The forward style of Joaquin Buckley should bring out a lot of the own offense that we see from Chris Curtis. But I gotta be honest, I'm pretty down on Chris Curtis based on his last performance. And the reason I say that is Chris Curtis is a classic example of, I might not be the best wrestler in the world, but my wrestling's good enough to negate your strengths as a wrestler. I have good enough takedown defense to force you to become a striker. And normally when he has those wrestlers become strikers, that's when we see Chris Curtis really become aggressive, put his combinations together, go to the body a lot, which is something I really like out of Chris Curtis, and then finish with combinations up to the head. We didn't really see that version of him in the Jack Hermansson fight, and yes, that might just be he has to respect the grappling threat of a guy like Jack Hermansson. But he had just done pretty much the same thing to Adolfo Vieira. And if you're not worried about the grappling styles of Adolfo Vieira, you probably wouldn't be about Hermansson too. So I'm just a little curious to see what version of Chris Curtis we will get moving forward. Not that I think he's just a completely different fighter. I want to see more of the first fighter that we saw him come into the UFC. And I do think that this fight stylistically with Buckley is going to force him to become more of that boxer. I will be curious though to see who's going to be moving forward, because I think the guy on the back foot, although yes, they can land that one big power shot, I don't know if Buckley's going to want to have the pressure of Chris Curtis coming towards him, throwing some of those combinations with his back up against the cage. I think that's going to be a really difficult position for him to be in.
If you look at it for Joaquin Buckley in the UFC, performance bonuses against Kasanganay, against Jordan Wright, against Ahoyo, and against Albert Duraev, a fight that he was losing until, Albert Duraev's just got one eye that blows up every time like a balloon, and it happened in that one. He got a great win right there. But if you do look at it, Buckley can kind of struggle against guys that throw a lot of kicks. Chris Curtis isn't a giant kick-heavy guy unless it's on Dana White's Contender Series. And he really does like to let his boxing go. And the thing that Curtis does well, he's a great counter striker. So Buckley's a guy that rushes forward a lot. Curtis can have a lot of success in those exchanges. We saw that in the Phil Haas fight. Curtis is great at defending takedowns. And if he's a better grappler than his opponent, go back to his fight in the PFL against Andrea Fialho. Well, he's having success on the feet. I'm going to take it down to the mat. Wow, I had even more success. So Curtis really well-rounded that way. Love the boxing combinations out of both stances. It's just the willingness to move forward and get going. And Curtis can struggle if you're a distance striker like Jack Hermansson. If you have a lot of success on the outside, that's where you can kind of struggle. Okay, do I move forward Are you going to make me come back and I counter? Because if it's all the way out, he can have a little bit of a struggle. But for Buckley, I know the reach, it's an extra inch, but he likes to really crowd his opponents and lunge in with a lot of his shots.
It really comes down to how good are you at fighting peekaboo-style boxers when you're fighting Joaquin Buckley, and it's as simple as that. It really is. Like, if you're a guy who can time his ducks and hit him before he can land the hook, you're going to beat him. Like, Kevin Holland beat the brakes off Joaquin Buckley, and I know it was his first fight in the UFC, but that was
on short notice,
and
too.
It was, but that was one of those performances where you just kind of realize what happens when everything goes wrong. It happens every now and then where just stylistically it doesn't really work out for you, and Buckley was quite a bit bigger than Kevin Holland. I know Holland was taller than him in that fight, but Buckley was obviously much larger than Kevin Holland. Kevin Holland's a thin guy. We saw it even at welterweight. But Buckley, he would get timed every single time he tried to do his duck, and Kevin Holland would hit him with a straight right down the middle. The difference between Holland, though, and his style of striking and Chris Curtis is Curtis is a lot more likely to counter it with a hook, and I do worry that that makes Curtis a little bit more susceptible to the big shot himself, and that's why I think this is a very 50-50 fight, honestly. Like, Joaquin Buckley could win by first round knockout. I would not be surprised whatsoever. If Chris Curtis went out there, moved forward, went to the body, started landing combinations, he could also win by first round knockout, and I would not be surprised at all.
Yeah, and Curtis opened a plus 105. He's a plus 120. Buckley minus 125 to a minus 140. We have a look at the Tapology vote. Surprise to us, they are to you. I'm going to say over under 70% Buckley.
That's tough. I thought you were going to say Curtis the favorite. It broke my brain. I'll say under.
You're going to say under, and it's, wow, 827 total votes, 62% Curtis, 60% by decision, 33% by knockout. For the favorite Buckley, 38% have him to win, 55% by decision, and 38% by knockout. I think Chris Curtis wins this fight because he's such a good counter striker. And for Joaquin Buckley, again, would I be surprised if he won? Not at all. But Curtis, what I like out of him, he's got a good chin. He's got good durability. And those things go hand in hand, but he also has good cardio as well. So I like him in a matchup like this. But for Buckley, what I learned out of him in his last fight, he's not out in the third round. And even though he has a lot of those big actions and he gets taken down and he gets completely just outclassed, he's always in these fights, and I love what I saw out of him even in the losses last time out.
And that's why I have Joaquin. Again, I think this is as 50-50 of a fight as there is. This is basically Chris Curtis versus Biggie Boy in the middleweight division, because whoever lands first could put the other one out. I agree with you, Chris Curtis has a good chin. I don't think you want to test that against Joaquin Buckley, though, by any means.
Just a second. You said, I don't think anybody should ever test their takedown defense or grappling against Rodolfo Vieira, but Chris Curtis must have ice water in his veins.
No, I didn't. I said if you're not worried about the grappling of Vieira, then you shouldn't be worried about the grappling of Hermanson, and he was. That's what I said.
And
I like Joaquin Buckley in this.
Go ahead. Yeah, you've got Buckley. I've got Curtis. It is a great fight.
I'll be curious to see, too, how they look physically, because in my mind, I still think Buckley's a bigger guy than Chris Curtis. I will be curious to see, because neither one of these guys are the tallest middleweights in the world. They're both normally going to have a height disadvantage, but I'll just be curious to see how they match up physically.
The hair definitely gives an advantage to Chris Curtis. We know this. But should be a great fight. Can't wait for it coming up in this card. Let us know down below in the comments section who you have. Big time fight at the top. It is the light heavyweight belt on the line. It's vacant. Blachowicz taking on Ankalaev. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks. We always say, let's get into it.